Before the story begins, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, so you don't miss more emotional and surprising stories ahead. And now let's dive into today's story. You need to downsize this house, Mom. The words came so calmly that for a moment I almost wondered if I had misheard them. Michael stood near the kitchen counter of the home I had lived in for over 30 years, his arms crossed, his expression carefully controlled, as if he had rehearsed the sentence more than once before saying it out loud. I remember the way the afternoon light came through the window, falling across the old wooden table where I had once helped him with school projects, where we had shared countless dinners after his father passed away. I was 68 years old, and yet in that instant I felt like I was being spoken to as if I were a stranger renting a room instead of the woman who had built every corner of this house with her own hands and sacrifices. I set down the dish towel slowly, buying myself a few seconds to understand what he meant, though deep down I already knew. Downsize. I repeated softly, not because I didn't understand the word, but because I needed to hear him say it again, needed to feel the weight of it properly before reacting. Michael nodded once, avoiding my eyes for a brief moment before forcing himself to meet my gaze again. It's too much house for you now. Maintenance, taxes, everything. It doesn't make sense anymore. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried something just as unsettling. A kind of detached practicality that made it sound like he was discussing a financial report instead of my life. I looked around the kitchen at the familiar cabinets I had painted myself years ago, at the refrigerator covered in old magnets from family trips, at the faint scratch marks near the doorway where he once learned to ride a small toy bike inside the house during a stormy winter. None of that seemed to exist in his voice anymore, only numbers and convenience. I've lived here since before you graduated college, I said quietly, my voice steady but low, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile between us. He sighed slightly, shifting his weight. I know, Mom, but things change. You can't stay in a place like this forever. The phrase lingered in the air, heavier than it should have been. Place like this. Not home. Not our home. Just a structure to be evaluated, reduced, managed. I noticed then the way he avoided sitting down, as if he didn't want to stay too long, as if this conversation was something to be delivered and completed rather than shared. Somewhere deeper in my mind, another realization began to form, slow and uncomfortable. This wasn't the first time he had spoken about practical changes, though until now they had been small suggestions, harmless on the surface. But something about today felt different, final in a way I couldn't yet name. I placed my hands on the edge of the counter to steady myself, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingers, and I wondered when exactly I had stopped being part of the decisions about my own life. The house felt different after he said those words, although nothing physical had changed in that moment. I found myself moving through the same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals, yet each object seemed slightly more distant, as if I were no longer fully part of the space I was standing in. Michael had not left immediately. He lingered near the doorway, checking his phone once, then again, as though waiting for something or someone to interrupt the conversation and relieve him from having to continue it. I noticed the way he avoided sitting at the table, the way his eyes drifted toward the hallway instead of staying on me, and I realized with a quiet heaviness that this was not a discussion for him, it was a decision already made in his mind. You would be more comfortable somewhere smaller, he said after a pause, as if offering me reassurance rather than instruction. I almost smiled at the irony of that sentence. Comfort had never been something I prioritized over stability or family, especially after his father passed away and I was left to manage everything alone. I had worked extra hours, delayed my own retirement plans, and even postponed medical appointments just to make sure this house remained ours. Now it was being described to me like a burden I had somehow failed to notice. I turned slightly toward the window, looking out at the small garden I had planted myself years ago, remembering how Michael used to run through it as a child, his laughter filling the same air that now felt so quiet. Where exactly would I go? I asked finally, not with anger but with genuine confusion. He hesitated before answering, which told me more than his words. There are good places nearby. Senior communities. You would have support activities, people your age. People your age. The phrase stayed with me longer than I expected, echoing in a way that made the house feel even emptier. I had never thought of myself as belonging to a category that needed to be relocated for convenience. I watched him carefully then, noticing how rehearsed his reasoning sounded, as if he had already discussed it with someone else and was now simply delivering the conclusion. A memory surfaced uninvited, of a recent Sunday dinner when his wife had mentioned, almost casually, that large properties required too much responsibility for one person alone. At the time I had brushed it off as a passing comment, but now it returned with a different weight, attaching itself to everything Michael was saying. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and placed my hand on the back of the chair where he used to sit as a teenager, remembering how he would talk about building his future while I listened, believing I would always be part of it. The silence between us grew longer, not uncomfortable for him but heavy for me. I could feel something shifting not just in the conversation, but in the entire structure of how I understood my place in this family. And for the first time I began to wonder whether this was truly about the house at all. The next morning did not bring clarity, only a strange continuation of the same silence that had settled between us the day before. I woke up earlier than usual, as I had done for years out of habit rather than necessity, and stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee that I barely tasted. The house creaked softly around me, familiar sounds that once felt comforting but now seemed almost uncertain, as if even the walls were listening differently. Michael had already left for work, leaving no note, only the faint impression that he had been here at all. I found myself walking through each room more slowly than usual, noticing things I had previously ignored, like how often he had begun to rearrange small details in the house without asking, or how certain drawers no longer contained what I remembered placing inside them. It was not obvious enough to accuse, but it was enough to make me pause. Later that afternoon I drove to the local grocery store, trying to maintain the rhythm of a normal day, yet even there I felt slightly detached, as if I were observing my own life rather than living it. When I returned I noticed a second car parked near the driveway, unfamiliar and polished, too new to belong to anyone I knew well. Inside the house I heard voices before I even closed the door completely. Michael was speaking and another voice responded, a woman's voice calm and deliberate. I stepped quietly into the hallway and stopped just before the kitchen entrance. Michael was seated at the table this time, leaning forward with his hands folded, while his wife Lauren stood beside him holding a folder filled with papers. My name was mentioned once, then again, not loudly, but with the careful tone people use when discussing something already decided. I remained still, listening without interrupting, something I had never done in my own home before. They were speaking about timing, about property evaluations, about what would be most practical, words that sounded reasonable on their own but felt heavy when placed together. I realized then that this was not a conversation being prepared for me to join, it was a conversation already moving forward without me. When I finally stepped into the kitchen, both of them turned slightly, not startled but aware, as if my arrival was expected at some point in the sequence. Lauren offered a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Michael straightened slightly, as though adjusting himself back into a version of composure he had already practiced. "Mom, we were just talking through some options," he said, carefully sliding one of the papers a few inches across the table without pushing it toward me. I looked at the folder, then at him, then at the empty chair beside him that no one had bothered to pull out for me. In that moment I understood something I had been avoiding since the first sentence he spoke the day before. This was no longer a suggestion. It was a plan in motion, and I was the only one still standing outside of it. After they left that afternoon, the house felt even quieter than before, as if the air itself had been rearranged without my permission. I stood in the kitchen long after the front door closed, staring at the empty space where the folder had been placed on the table, as though its presence still lingered like an unresolved sentence. My hands rested on the counter, but my thoughts were no longer in the room. They kept returning to the way Michael had avoided my eyes, the way Lauren had spoken with calm precision, as if every word had already been agreed upon long before I entered. I moved slowly through the house, not because I was searching for anything specific, but because I suddenly felt like a guest in a place I had once built from nothing. In the living room, I paused near the bookshelf where family photographs had always stood in careful arrangement. Michael as a child holding a small baseball glove, his father standing beside him with a hand on his shoulder, and later images of holidays, birthdays, and ordinary days that once felt permanent. I realized then how easily memory could be reduced to decoration when no one else valued it the same way. That evening Michael returned later than usual. He did not mention the earlier conversation immediately, instead asking a simple question about dinner as if nothing significant had occurred. I watched him carefully as he placed his keys on the counter, noticing how effortlessly he could step between two versions of reality, one where everything was still normal, and another where decisions were being made without me. We sat at the table together, though the silence between us carried more weight than any conversation. I tried to eat, but the food had no real taste, as if my senses were distracted by something deeper unfolding beneath the surface. Finally, I asked him quietly what he meant by options earlier in the day. He paused for a moment, then exhaled slowly, as if choosing words that would soften something already firm. "We are just trying to make things easier for you, Mom," he said. Easier. The word landed gently, but it carried an implication I could not ignore. Easier for whom, I wondered, though I did not say it out loud. Instead, I studied his face, searching for the boy I once knew in the man sitting across from me. For a brief moment, I remembered a time when he would ask for my advice before making even the smallest decision, when my opinion had been something he sought rather than something he was preparing to move past. After dinner, I remained seated while he left the room, taking his phone with him as if there were still more conversations waiting beyond mine. I stayed at the table long after the dishes had cooled, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling around me. Something had shifted, not loudly or suddenly, but in a way that could not be reversed once seen clearly. And for the first time, I understood that what was unfolding was not a discussion about where I would live next, but a quiet rewriting of where I belonged at all. The following morning arrived with a heaviness that felt different from the previous days, as if something had already been set in motion and I was simply waiting for it to reach me. I woke before sunrise again, but this time I did not immediately go to the kitchen. Instead, I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, listening to the house as it slowly came alive around me. Every sound felt more deliberate than before, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant settling of wood in the walls, even the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. When I finally walked downstairs, I noticed a thin envelope placed neatly on the kitchen counter, positioned in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It did not have my name written in handwriting I recognized, but I already knew it was meant for me. I opened it slowly, not out of fear but out of a growing sense that I was no longer part of decisions that involved me. Inside were printed pages, formal and carefully arranged, filled with phrases that sounded polite but carried weight beneath their surface. Property valuation, transition planning, suggested relocation timeline. Words that belonged in meetings I had never been invited to attend. I sat down at the table without realizing I had moved, holding the pages as my eyes moved across them more than once, not because I did not understand them, but because I was trying to understand how long this had been prepared without me knowing. Michael appeared shortly after, standing in the doorway as if he had been waiting for the right moment rather than interrupting anything. He looked at the envelope in my hands and then at my face, his expression carefully controlled. "Mom, I was going to talk to you about that today," he said, his voice steady but distant. I placed the papers back on the table without responding immediately, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers as if it could ground me in something familiar. "How long has this been ready?" I asked quietly. He hesitated just long enough for the answer to form on its own. "A few weeks," he admitted. "We just wanted to make sure everything was organized before bringing it up." Organized. The word echoed in my mind, detached from the reality of what I was holding. I looked at him then, really looked at him, trying to reconcile the boy I once raised with the man who now stood in front of me speaking as if my entire life could be rearranged into a plan. There was no anger in his face, only certainty, and that certainty was somehow more unsettling than any argument could have been. I asked him if he had spoken to anyone else about it, and he nodded slightly, mentioning names of people I had trusted over the years, names that now felt strangely distant. As he spoke, I realized that this was no longer about a suggestion or even a conversation. It was a structure already built around me, with or without my participation. When he finished speaking, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of decisions I had not made, timelines I had not agreed to, and a version of my life that no longer included my own voice in its direction. I placed my hand on the edge of the table again, steadying myself not because I felt weak, but because I understood clearly for the first time that what I was holding in my hands was not just paper, but a boundary being drawn between the life I had lived and the life they were preparing for me. That evening, I could not bring myself to sit in the same places I usually did. The house felt unchanged on the surface, yet every corner now seemed to carry a different meaning, as if each room had quietly been reassigned in a plan I had not approved. I moved slowly through the hallway and stopped near the front window, watching the street outside where neighbors walked their dogs and cars past with the ordinary rhythm of lives untouched by quiet decisions being made behind closed doors. When Michael returned, he did not bring the same hesitation he had shown before. There was a kind of focus in his movements, as if the conversation we had in the morning had already settled into something final in his mind. He placed his keys down and immediately began speaking about timing again, about next steps, about how soon things would need to be organized properly for the transition. I listened without interrupting, noticing how easily he had shifted from uncertainty to procedure, as if repetition had replaced hesitation. Lauren arrived shortly after him, carrying a small stack of documents and a calm expression that did not change when she saw me. She greeted me politely, but there was no pause in her purpose. They both sat at the table, and I remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, observing how naturally they occupied the space of decision-making while I remained on its edge. Eventually I sat down not because I agreed, but because I wanted to understand how far this had already gone without me. Lauren began explaining details in a measured voice, speaking about property assessments and housing options in a way that made everything sound reasonable, even considerate. Michael added comments occasionally, reinforcing points as if confirming a shared conclusion rather than building one in front of me. Noticed how often they used phrases like "for your safety" and "to reduce stress," words that wrapped finality in softness. At one point, Lauren slid another document toward me, this one outlining suggested residences, each described in calm, professional language that erased any sense of personal history. I did not touch it immediately. Instead, I looked at both of them and asked quietly if any part of this required my agreement or if it had already been decided. The silence that followed was brief but revealing. Michael exhaled and leaned back slightly, saying that they were only trying to make things easier, that they had already discussed it with professionals to ensure everything would be handled properly. Professionals. The word confirmed what I had already begun to understand in fragments over the past days. This was no longer a family conversation. It had become a process. I placed my hands together on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my palms, and I realized that while they spoke about transition and preparation, they were no longer speaking about my present life, only its replacement. For the first time, I stopped trying to interpret their intentions as care and began to see them as structure, carefully built and steadily closing around a life I had assumed was still mine to shape. After that meeting, I stopped counting time in the usual way. The days no longer felt separate from one another, but instead blended into a continuous stretch of conversations, documents, and carefully chosen words that all pointed in the same direction. Michael and Lauren began to visit more frequently, sometimes together, sometimes separately, always with a sense of purpose that made each arrival feel less like a visit and more like an appointment. I noticed how they would stand in different parts of the house, observing rather than living in it, discussing measurements, repairs, and practical adjustments as if the home itself had become an object to be evaluated rather than a place that held decades of my life. One afternoon, I overheard Michael speaking on the phone near the hallway. His voice was lower than usual, but the words were clear enough for me to understand pieces of the conversation. He mentioned dates, signatures, and readiness. There was no mention of asking me, only informing others about when things would be finalized. I stood still at the end of the corridor, not interrupting, simply listening as the sound of his certainty filled the space between us. Later that night, I went into the study where my late husband's belongings were still kept in a cabinet I rarely opened. Inside were old documents, letters, and records that I had not looked through in years. I did not know exactly what I was searching for at first, only that I needed to understand whether the present situation had been building longer than I realized. As I went through the papers slowly, I began to notice details I had once overlooked, financial arrangements, property notes, and handwritten instructions that seemed simple at the time but now carried new weight when viewed together. Nothing was directly alarming on its own, but the pattern forming between them made me pause more than once. At some point, I sat down at the edge of the desk and realized how long I had been holding my breath without noticing. The house was quiet, but it was no longer a comforting silence. It felt structured, as if every room had begun aligning itself toward an outcome already chosen. The next morning, Michael arrived earlier than expected. He did not come alone. A man in a formal suit followed him inside, carrying a leather briefcase and introducing himself in a professional tone that immediately shifted the atmosphere of the room. There was no discussion of general ideas this time, only specifics. The man placed documents on the table with practiced precision and began explaining procedures, timelines, and legal steps in a voice that treated everything as settled except for the final execution. I listened without speaking, my hands resting on the edge of the table, as I watched Michael respond with brief confirmations, as if everything being said had already been agreed upon somewhere I was not present. At one point, the man asked a question that required my acknowledgement, and for the first time the conversation paused and turned toward me completely. The room waited for my response, not with urgency, but with expectation, as if my answer would simply complete something already designed. In that silence, I understood that what was unfolding was no longer about suggestions or even decisions being discussed within the family. It had moved into a stage where everything had been prepared in advance, and my presence now existed only to finalize what others had already set into motion. The following morning arrived with a stillness that felt heavier than sleep itself, as if the house had accepted something I had not yet agreed to. I woke early out of habit, but instead of going downstairs, I remained seated at the edge of my bed for a long moment, listening to the faint sounds of movement somewhere deeper in the house. When I finally stepped into the hallway, I noticed voices coming from the kitchen again, low and controlled, the same tone that had become increasingly familiar over the past days. Michael and Lauren were already there, and this time the man in the formal suit had returned with them. His briefcase was open on the table, and inside were neatly arranged documents that looked more final than anything I had seen before. I stopped just outside the doorway, not immediately entering, watching instead as the man spoke in a steady voice about completion, signatures, and formal approval. The language was calm, almost polite, but every sentence carried the weight of conclusion rather than discussion. Michael stood beside the table, nodding occasionally, while Lauren pointed at sections on the page as if confirming details already agreed upon. No one noticed me at first, or perhaps they chose not to. When I finally stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted slightly, not in tension, but in acknowledgement, as if a missing piece had arrived at its designated place. The man in the suit greeted me professionally and asked if I was ready to proceed. The question was simple, but the implication behind it was not. I looked at the documents spread across the table, each page filled with structured language that reduced years of life into decisions already categorized and arranged. Michael spoke gently, saying that everything had been prepared to make the process easier for me, that nothing was being taken away, only adjusted. Adjusted. The word lingered in the air again, repeating itself in my mind in a way that made it lose all meaning. I sat down slowly, not because I accepted what was happening, but because I needed to see how far it had already gone. The man slid one of the papers closer to me, indicating where my signature would be required. For a brief moment, the room became completely silent, not out of respect, but out of expectation. All eyes were on me, waiting for a simple motion that would complete something they had clearly built step by step without my involvement. I studied the paper without touching it, noticing how neatly everything had been organized, how efficiently my life had been translated into legal structure. There was no anger in me at that moment, only a growing clarity that felt colder than emotion. I realized that if I signed, the story would continue exactly as they had written it, but if I did not, something else would have to begin. And for the first time since this began, I understood that the silence in the room was not asking for agreement. It was waiting to see whether I still believed I was required to give it. The room remained still, not because time had stopped, but because every person inside it seemed to be waiting for a single action that would determine how everything continued. The man in the suit kept his hands folded near the documents, maintaining professional patience, while Michael stood slightly behind him with an expression that tried to remain calm but could not fully hide the tension beneath it. Lauren's eyes moved between the pages and my face, as if measuring the distance between expectation and outcome. I remained seated, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, not touching the pen that had been placed carefully beside the final signature line. For a long moment, I studied the document again, not reading it for the first time but understanding it in a different way than they intended. It was not just a transition plan, not just adjustments or simplifications as they had repeatedly described it. It was a conclusion written in advance, with my agreement positioned as the final required step. I finally looked up at Michael, and I saw in his eyes something I had not seen clearly before. It was not anger and it was not cruelty. It was certainty shaped by assumption, the belief that love and practicality could justify the removal of someone from their own foundation. I gently pushed the paper back across the table, not with force but with quiet finality. The movement was small, yet it changed the energy in the room more than any raised voice could have. The man in the suit glanced at Michael, then at me, as if recalculating the situation in real time. I stood slowly, not in defiance but in clarity, and for the first time since this began, I allowed my voice to carry without hesitation. I told them that I would not be signing anything today, not because I did not understand what was being offered, but because I understood it completely. Michael opened his mouth slightly as if to respond immediately, but no words came out at first. Lauren shifted her stance, her expression tightening just enough to reveal surprise she had not prepared for. I continued calmly, explaining that decisions about my life, my home, and my future would no longer be processed as if they were administrative tasks requiring approval from others. The man in the suit closed the folder slightly, waiting for direction that no longer existed in the way he had expected. Then I reached into the drawer beside the table and placed another envelope in front of them. It had been there for some time, prepared long before this morning, though they were only seeing it now. I told them that arrangements had already been made, not to oppose them, but to ensure that my life would not be defined by decisions made without me. Michael stepped forward slightly, asking what I meant, his voice no longer as controlled as before. I looked at him directly and said that while they had been planning how to simplify my life, I had already been preparing how to preserve it. The silence that followed was no longer filled with expectation. It was filled with realization. For the first time I was no longer waiting for their decision, and they were no longer certain they understood mine. And that's the end of today's story. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.